finding the book The Secret of Light in 2007-ish was definitely the ultimate turning point for me, because that book really led to a whole host of events that I would have never otherwise conceived even being possible. In fact, they weren't possible then either. So, like for instance, becoming president of Walter and Leo Russell's University of Science and Philosophy that they started back in 1948. It was actually due to reading that book that would lead me to that position. And I spent 7 years with that organization and was able to get the artwork back out on display from a dank warehouse to the world stage. It's all on display currently in Waynesboro, Virginia at 518 West Main Street, historic downtown Waynesboro. And it's probably in the top 10 largest museums in the state of Virginia, I would say. 32,500 square foot building, and 64 plus tons of art, sculpture, and personal effects were moved. And over a period of 9 days, we did our grand opening for that on November 1st, 2019, right before the Rona psychological operation happened. And so, yeah, that all those things were really, if you'd have sat me down in 2010 and said, in 5 years from now, you're going to be president of the university, I would have laughed you out of the room. Even my own mom, when I told her, she said, you didn't even go to college. So how can you possibly do that? And my famous last words that I've grown accustomed to saying to people who perceive the impossible is, watch me. So those are words I live by. But yeah, that's some of those moments, I'd say, after reading The Secret of Light, were huge surprises to me, but pivotal turning points in my life, to answer your question.
Yeah, from finding a book to becoming president of the university in the memory of the individual that wrote the book, that is pretty amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, with some of your background, you're a volunteer firefighter currently as well. How
Yeah,
has, that's correct. How has the work that you've done, with Walter Russell's work or dealing with that kind of thing helped in the world of volunteer fighting and the chaos in that world?
well, that's interesting because, I really felt like I wanted to do something to help out my community. The more I got on top of my own life, the more balance I attained, the more the calling to serve my community in some way, shape, and form took sort of a front and center. And I think that happens to a lot of people, but they get to a good point in life, good place where everything is well to do and you're living a very balanced life. And then that's the point at which you can safely extend yourself to your neighborhood, to your community. And that's very much in line with the teachings themselves that, the Russells would say, you have no business working to tell somebody else. I should say, you have no business telling somebody else or your neighborhood to get their order and affairs in balance if your own affairs and home are out of balance. So in that vein, once you do get your own life a semblance of balance and all things moving well, then it's at that point that you can safely extend yourself beyond the confines of your own home or your property lines, for instance. And firefighting was something I had loved since I was a kid. I used to run to the corner to see the fire truck go by whenever I'd hear the sirens and it was coming out of the fire station. And when I was actually 2, my mom tells this story very well, but I would walk across a 4-lane highway to go to the fire station 3 blocks from my home. I actually crawled out of the window to go see what that noise was. And so she always likes to tell that story to people that haven't heard it, but she goes, you know what my son used to do? But yeah, I was a little explorer. I was always wandering around in nature. But yeah, firefighting was always, I had the toy truck when I was a kid. I had obviously the experience of being around real fire trucks as a kid. I'd ride my bike up there when I was old enough and just sit there and listen to the fire guys talk about all this and that. And, they even had me invited me in to eat dinner with them a couple different times. And here I am, 7, 8, maybe 9 years old, just hanging out, and so that's always been a special place in my heart. And that as well, they needed somebody to volunteer. And I would just add the caveat that one of our instructors in wildlands training said, you may not know this, but volunteerism is at an all-time low in the United States. And so I was really happy that I had done something, to volunteer in my community. And I implore people, consider it, because, it still is that way. And to get involved with something, it doesn't have to be firefighting, it could be your local church or a food bank or something along those lines. But all these little things, if you're in a good place, are very rewarding and fulfilling, to help out your community in some way. So firefighting was it for me, though.
That's great. Yeah, I have some friends that do similar work, producing content, that also went that route into the volunteer firefighting, and they took a course. And I'm not sure where they are right now, but I think they are like out performing their craft, with all the wildfires during the summer. Around here, we get a lot of that. And kind of hand in hand, radio guys, I'm sure you come across a lot of those types around here where I live. It's pretty rural, and so the radio stuff kind of goes right in line with that sort of thing, like volunteer firefighting, being available, being, equipped and ready to handle an emergency or respond to something. And it kind of takes a learning curve with the radio world to get there, and same with firefighting. And so I've dabbled in the radio. I'm up to the part where I can respond in an emergency and be, a relay or help out if fires are, wreaking havoc in an area. We had some of that recently over the summer, where people were completely without communication, right? And their families are in there and they're trying to evacuate. And so, yeah, being available for the community when in the worst times, you're trained up to be available when there's real need that's out there. So that's amazing.
Yeah, and fire stations, I've heard this said this way too, are the hearts of communities, especially rural communities, volunteer in particular. But typically, if there's a tornado that hits town, or something along those lines, any form of flooding or some type of natural disaster, for instance, even man-made ones, but typically people will go to the fire department to find out what's going on. It's a good source of information. They usually have, directives, what you can do, how you can help out, as a community volunteer, things like that, especially in emergencies. So it is, as Ben Franklin said too, it's the oldest profession in the United States. And my beloved just brought me some herbal tea. So
Perfect.
here's to you. Yeah, it
Good
is
timing.
actually the oldest profession. So, and it is a volunteer one, and it started out that way in the United States. So it'd be great to see it continue.
Yeah, I'm smiling big because, there's the movement of volunteerism, and I'm not opposed to like what you're saying with volunteering, but I am nitpicky about that particular philosophy. So people watching are probably like waiting for me to jump on it, but this is not, what I'm discussing is nothing to do with what you're talking about. We're getting more into the weeds over with what I'm picking apart with volunteerism on, different moral arguments. So for those listening, and that's not directed as a question for you, but those that are like waiting for me to come up with some weird drift into voluntarism and the argument there, we're not going to do that. But what we're going to talk about is we live in a materialist scientific world, or scientist materialism is rampant. It's the main worldview, I would say. And you talk about an inside out cosmology. What does that mean?
Well, it's a one way, you could say. It's inside out in the sense that everything is materialistic. It's physicalism, and that's a philosophy. And that's what materialism is, as much as Stephen Hawking's philosophy is dead quote. He thought it rang true, and a lot of materialists do think that rings true. It's quite far from the truth, being that physicalism, materialism is a philosophy. And so it's sort of the inside out. What I mean by that is it turns the spiritual inside out and completely disregards it for the most part. Um, there's really no spiritual side to materialists. They pretty much poo-poo on the whole entire subject, you could say. So, in fact, to the point of leaving consciousness at the door, literally, uh, not allowed to come in the room. So, to the point of saying that consciousness itself is an effect of the brain, something that the brain developed over time, whereas standard idealism, mystical teachings, mysticism of the authentic nature, not the New Age version of fa mystical teachings, things like that, but actual true mystical experience uh, certainly points to consciousness, does not leave it at the door, but invites it in with open arms, and in fact looks at it more causally. Consciousness is the cause of physical matter in especially the works of Walter and Leo Russell, for instance. And that's really, the difference between these kinds of cosmological approaches to the grander questions of the universe, existence, and nature. And so there's not really anybody who's been a materialist who can point to consciousness in such a way, because they thoroughly denounce the mystical side of life altogether. In fact, most churches do today as well, unfortunately. It's quasi-mystical. It's rooted in ritual more than it is the mystical that we're actually its causal formation, and unfortunately for Christianity, that now you've got this sort of hybrid blend with Russell Brand and Jordan Peterson leading the charge, with this comeback to fa Christianity. It's the mystical quality that has been removed from a lot of life due to the fact that materialism has been, more or less in charge of the chairs of science in all the universities worldwide, as well as just sort of setting the foundation for where mankind is headed. But that's sort of, I'm happy to say, heavily being questioned now. A lot of people would never question science when I started my work in 2008-9, and finally in 2010, my own podcast. I set out to debunk the scientism and call it out for what it is. And Russell was a huge inspiration for me because he remonstrated against this idea of materialistic science. He denounced this one-way heat, death, dying, exhalation-only universe and called it into question. And he put the creator back at the heart of his science, as opposed to removing the creator from creation. So that's what I mean, inside out and upside down, and just thoroughly materialistic, denouncing all spirit in favor of matter.
Let's talk about light, and not as like photons, but in the way that you use the term, or also how can people find that light within themselves or start to think about it in the way that you've come to understand light?
Well, I'll just point to Walter Russell's work. He's got about the best explanation. He says there's basically two kinds of light: the light of mind, which is capital L light, and then the lowercase light, which is the divided light color spectrum. And when you pass white light through a prism, when you pass, in Russell science, white light through the inert gases, it divides into the 7 major color spectrum. Goethe showed that when you put those 7 colors on a wheel and spin it, it turns white. So literally, it becomes that which it once was, you could say. There's a lot of little interesting things like why are movie screens white? Because they won't reflect any of the colors if they're not white. If they're black, they'll absorb them. So the screen of space itself, if you invert a galaxy picture or a picture of the night sky, it will appear white, and the divisions of that light will appear dark. So the stars and things like that, galaxies will, in an inverted photo, you're actually seeing what I call a selfie of God, which is showing that the mind is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. It's everywhere at once. And that's a good way to look at it. My Knowing the Creator series 101, I went into different slides to put that point forward. It does match some of Walter Russell's work, which is where I learned that from. But the light of mind itself in the mystical experience is, from what Russell would describe, the illumination experience, scientifically defined as a short circuit between the two lobes of the brain, which produces a flash of light. And you actually pass through that color spectrum into the white light of mind, which is why he said God was mind, or the white light, the still magnetic light. And so that understood scientifically just made sense to me. I've had my own experiences that confirm this. Near-death experiences confirm this. There's tens of thousands of those. One could read these accounts for years and find all kinds of supporting relevance to that claim. Not only that, but many of the historical illumination experiences also echo that. There's a great book by Dr. Richard Morris Buck called Cosmic Consciousness, and he points out the 40 most apropos cases that demonstrate that these individuals in their writings must have had this experience of cosmic consciousness to be able to write what they did. I would include multiple others in there. Of course, when he wrote that in 1901, many of the people that have had those experiences since weren't included, including Walter Russell, because his experiences came later. He didn't even write about them until the late 40s, early 50s in the home study course. So, but yeah, the main differences are small, lowercase light is the divided color spectrum, and the capital L light in these teachings by Russell is the mind or God or consciousness itself. And that's something that I think is fairly easy to understand.
Yeah, thanks for the book recommendation. I've heard you mention it a few times. I picked it up last night and started going through it. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like it's going to be a good foundation in what you're talking about. And,
excellent. That's the one by Buck?
Let's see. Which is the author that you mentioned?
Dr. Richard Morris Buck.
Yeah, I was thinking Bucke, but yeah, Buck. It's
yeah,
with the Bucke, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks really interesting. I didn't know it was written that like 126 years ago or whatever, 124 years ago.
Yeah, he was actually a friend and sort of a protege of Walt Whitman. And so he was very inspired by Walt Whitman, and he was always intrigued by Walt's nature, his ability to just recite poetry off the tip of his tongue, and how he was so able to inspire people around him, especially in poetry readings that he attended. And he had left Whitman's home late one night and had his own illumination experience just because he was so inspired. And really, as Walter says, inspiration is the language of light. So if you have an inspiration, follow it, stay with it, because that's that's as close to illumination as you're going to get if you don't have the actual experience. But just continue to follow that inspiration, because that could possibly lead to much more. And that's how, again, God chooses to speak to man, is through flashes of inspiration.
So people listening to this are hearing something similar, like, our minds create reality. They may, start to lump this in with some of the new age variants of the law of attraction. And how is what we're talking about here different from, the new age variant of the law of attraction?
Well, because the law of attraction states that if you just think something, it's more likely to happen or bound to happen. Um, Walter could not disagree more with such an assertion. And I just posted a post on my socials, um, slide that I had done from a talk I gave in 2024, but it talked about the two directions of thinking. We think outwardly toward material, which is our resources, and we think inwardly toward our imagination, toward our mental faculties, which is our resourcefulness. But if you're just one or the other, like the materialists, they typically, think outward only through their senses, where the daydreamer, thinks only inwardly toward his imagination. And either one of those by themselves is mediocrity. What genius does is thinks in both directions and inspires itself by the ability to comprehend their own ability to do so. So it's sort of a purposeful way of thinking versus being distracted by one or the other. But so we have this inward and outward direction of thinking and what geniuses do. And we're all geniuses in training. Just because we're not at that point yet doesn't mean we don't have that ability. But what geniuses do is they learn to think in both directions as needed. So they can produce more and capture that inspiration more frequently.
Another one I pulled from your website was man is mind, matter is what mind does. Can you tell me more about the meaning behind that quote?
Yeah, well, the man idea, we are the idea in the creator's mind. Man is an idea expressed as physicality, mentality, and spirituality, all three in one. The Japanese call that the triangle of life. It's been called that by other cultures as well. But the pinnacle of the triangle is the spiritual. The left corner is the physical, and the right corner is the mental. And the two bottom corners, when those are in balance, fulfill the missing third, which is the spirit. The spirit becomes the fulcrum of the two. So man is mind, matter is what mind does. Basically, that's my own little adage, and it just more or less means that we are an idea of God, and existence in bodies is what mind does, what man does. And his existence, when lived with intent correctly, you could say the boiled down one line to all religions is the purpose of man. What is it? And as the Russells would say, and those religions as well, the purpose of man is to manifest his creator. So the creative faculty within you is that which is closest to God. And when we create that consciously, whatever it is, whatever the art or expressive interest that you have, when you live that and express it, that's when you're the closest to God that you'll ever be. And so you're manifesting your creator versus just believing in one that's going to come back someday.
Yeah, I think that you've said also that Russell wasn't a card-carrying hermeticist, but would you say that, especially, the law of mentalism being the first law of hermeticism, is there a strong overlap? Basically, even if he wouldn't say that, oh yes, he was a hermeticist or label himself that way, seems to me there's a lot of carryover.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of you could say parallelisms with hermeticism. He didn't identify as anything not even a Christian. But he did have views about the historical Jesus. He did have views about things in the Bible that Jesus never said, for instance, saying there was a devil, or this or that. But I could name several. But in regard to Hermeticism, he certainly had parallelisms with it, though he did not use the term himself. I tend to connote that there are some extreme similarities in his work with alchemy too, as well, because alchemy was typically um, a marriage of opposites, and Jung is someone who studied alchemy frequently, and his wholeness principle is very similar to Walter's uh, principle of working knowingly with God as one. It's just said in a different way. So um, and the Russells even have a saying for that. It's all illuminates speak the same language, only the words vary. So when you encounter this kind of a teaching, a wholeness teaching, it's easy once you start to understand the language. And I consider Russell's work to be very much like a Rosetta Stone that explained a whole lot of other things I had read but hadn't really grokked or understood fully. And when I had read his work and began to understand it, Jung made a lot more sense. Krishnamurti made a lot more sense. Falconelli, I could go on and on with examples. Yogananda, just different mystical teachings from the past, Hermeticism, things like that, begin to make a lot more sense. Russell worked with the cube and the sphere as opposed to the square and the circle in traditional alchemy. So it was sort of a three-dimensional alchemy, I would call it. But his symbols and his pictures and drawings echoed very similar themes to what you'd find in some of those ancient alchemical drawings. And just to clarify, I don't think I fully answered the last question, but the difference between the secret law of attraction, if you will, and Russell's work is they absolutely said that thinking about something isn't enough unless it's balanced by action. So that there's a complete advice, or let's say a complete curriculum. It's not half of what works, it's fully what works. If God just thought about the universe but didn't act to divide its stillness and rest state into action sequences that repeat and are recorded as they're repeated, there'd be no physical universe. So thinking is not enough. You have to balance your thinking with action, which are the two directions of thinking.
Yeah, you've put it before, like thoughts must be given a body. How can someone use this concept to start to understand? Because I've been going through Russell's work, especially more in preparation for interviewing you, but long back from when I first came across your work. And I think in an application for someone listening to this, one of the things that can happen is if we start to think about things differently than this one way, one direction, no spirit, thoughts are just random things happening, nothing special going on there, to a view of maybe you can tap into something greater. Maybe the thoughts aren't just, maybe sometimes they're just garbage. Maybe other times there's things happening that aren't just the worries of the day, the anxieties of the day, but actually, we're tapping into something greater through our minds. So how could someone use that understanding to start to create a body for their thoughts, or think about it in this way where we're involved in this process? This two-way creative function is something that's not happening out there, right? It's something that's happening inside of us.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, again, Knowing the Creator 101 is a great 4-part series that talks about that. In particular, the process of creation is part 3 of that. But more or less, neuroscientists have tried to pinpoint, for instance, it's said we have 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day as an individual human being. And I like to say, which one of those thoughts are you going to hold? So the thoughts we hold, for instance, a lot of people sleep with a pad of paper next to their bed so that they can write down their thoughts, their imaginings. They should wake up in the middle of the night out of a dream, they like to write those things down. Oftentimes we'll have inspirations, but we won't have the time to really hold that thought. And then you try to, a few days go by or even a few hours and you start to think back, what was that thought I had? And it's already gone, but it was a great idea. So whatever you need to do to remember it, to write it down, to hold it, the point of holding the thought is to build it, into physical being. And that is the bridge from thinking to reality, is when you begin to take that thought apart and build a body for it, which consists many times of many pieces. So, and maybe even requires many tools. For instance, a sculptor, you can't sculpt if you don't have the right tools for cutting clay. So obviously a painter can't, unless you plan on finger painting, but you got to buy an easel, you have to buy canvases and brushes and paint. As a musician, you can't just airplay guitar. I mean, you can, but you look silly out there. So you have to buy a guitar. You have to acquire your tool set, if you will. But the tools are what help to bring the idea out. And most of us do this and don't even realize it. Most of us are able to create bodies because we hold thoughts. But how often do we actually connect this to a physical process, a process of creation, if you will? And that's what Walter and Leo focused on in the home study course, in large part was, how you can build bodies of your own through inspiration and working knowingly with the creator. Because this is, again, all mind is the mind of the creator. So there's only one mind, and each of us are a part. Like there's only one ocean. Each of us as individuals are drops in that ocean, and we can contain much more than ourselves in that individual drop. And that's our inspiration, our imagination. And if we can hold a thought and acquire the tools and then acquire the skills through practice, because that's what it takes to be a great anything requires 10,000 hours, it's been said, to master any subject, any profession, anything like that. Techniques are the skill sets that use these tools better than somebody else who may be an intermediary or an amateur or beginner. So yeah, it takes a lot of practice. So if you're going to become good at something, you have to work at it. And again, there's a difference there between a lot of the new age thinks that, oh, if you just think about it, it'll just start happening. Well, it doesn't work that way, folks. So, but if you do practice your technique and acquire the right, skills and tools that you need, then producing a work of art in that respective category, whatever it is, could be, culinary arts, it could be sculpting, or even doing yard work. There's ways to decorate and trim trees that check out the documentary called A Man Called Pearl, or A Man Named Pearl, which shows how this gentleman was able to sculpt his yard into something that literally hundreds of thousands of people came to see in Alabama, I think it was. But just little things like that we do every day. You're recording this podcast. This is a body. It will be a body that is released on the internet for the world to enjoy. So, this is your inspiration, and you're in the process of creating it right now in this recording. Your dog just seconded it.
Yeah, he's in with you on this.
Agreed. But yeah, it's fairly simple. It's not really as complex as most people think. And the faith is in you to get off your butt and do it. That's faith to me is an action word. Hope and faith are action words. I don't like to think of them as, I don't use them in a context outside of action. So that way they're sort of living things, more or less, as opposed to things to believe in.
How does finding stillness or creating spaces for exploring this kind of stuff play into this? I mean, so in our modern life, we have just a deluge of things coming at us every day. And even if you're trying to disconnect, it seems like we're always still kind of connected in one way or the other. I find it very hard to wall off the outside world and focus on being creative. I know that you've found some tools to do this and ways or techniques, unless you just automatically go into that flow state. Stillness probably a super important part of that. But what other tools, or how important is it for people to find that space in order to be creative and find true creativity?
Yeah, you've heard the term man cave. I'd highly recommend having your own, or your studio. That's what a studio turned from a man cave to a studio. But I don't just mean, man cave like where there's a beer cooler and uh, a foosball table and a pool table for your buddies to watch the game. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to what's classically also known as the artist's retreat. The studio, is the quiet place where you can be still. And the point of stillness, stilling your mind from the rampant worries of everyday living. The bills are due, or I need gas in the car. I got to change the tires, or the house needs painted, or there's always an incessant voice nagging inside our minds. This must be done. That must be done. I got an appointment at 6, but I can't relax for 8 hours before it because there's too much, So the stilling of the incessant uh, talking voice in your head, which is always worried about this or that, or even the past in some cases, that can lead to neuroses and even psychopathy if you're not careful. But the ability to still that, the nagging voice and just listen to the voice of inspiration, and you have to, that's why I say it's important. If you have an inspiration, don't let it go. Walter himself would say the greatest voice, the only treasure, the greatest treasure and the only treasure is that inspiration, which is God talking directly to you. And that inspiration is the language of light that God uses to communicate to man. But unfortunately, man, instead of following that voice and that inspiration, he goes and buys a ticket to Coney Island instead, or to Six Flags, or to Netflix for the latest part 39, season 5, of your favorite series. So where is the inspiration? It's very rare in people today to have it, because they're always filling their head. They're always opting not for silence, but for something to fill that space, some noise, some audio, video, generally. If it's not the screen of the phone or updating your latest socials, then you're not, you're basically not going to get it. So to really have a place where you can lay all that electronics down, you can turn off the TV, you can turn off the noise, the radio, and just sit with yourself and clear your mind to think about what it is you want to create, and ideas often will come at that point. So, but again, who really does that anymore, and some people say it's good to meditate, it's good to pray. They're sort of a synonymous practice, but I don't do either of those things. My prayer is always a living one. I would say it doesn't end 24/7. It goes on and on. Sort of a waking meditation, Russell would call it, where you're always in constant communion with the Creator in yourself via yourself. So through yourself to God. And it's a practice, but one that ultimately does lead to more inspiration, not less, more synchronicities, not less, which synchronicities to me are the thermostat, the gauge of understanding your closeness to God. The more synchronicities you see in your life, the closer you are. So that's a living practice that is lifelong, and it doesn't end, but it can get better and better as you practice at it. So, but yeah, just, learning to follow your bliss it's been called, Joseph Campbell, to walk the thin line, uh, just trying to be centered as best you can. Again, if you don't have those incessant worries always nagging in the back of your head, you're going to find a place to reflect and find that stillness where you're able to entertain new ideas and new inspirations.
This morning I was writing down on a piece of paper, because I've been using pretty heavily this method for the capture, especially at night or in the morning. I have like a routine, but I have papers all over right now, just writing down thoughts that are coming to me as you're speaking, and I like to be in the habit of doing that. Keeping a pen and these 3x5 cards around has been huge for me. But this morning I was writing down uh, an idea on creating a course to offer as part of a thing that I'm building on my website, to show people techniques for doing this, and not only like capturing it, but then putting it into motion. So yeah, like talking about synchronicities, this, I was going through just some sort of affirmation stuff this morning, and then I took some time to write down my idea and put it down in a form, and then put it in an inbox on my desk, right? And that inbox will be processed at some point. I'll come across my thoughts again and I'll put them into motion. So I think having a system, I called it systematized success, I think, and I had subsections that I want to offer to, because I have a crazy system that I think people would be annoyed by. But I'm so interested in capturing the thoughts and not letting them slip by, that I've created an elaborate system to do that. And some people, it'd probably be a lot less tool specific and structured in that way. For example, my wife thinks in a completely different way than I do about all these things. And the stuff I do would just be a complete nuisance to her. Where to me, it's what creates success. It's how I do things with excellence. How I try to strive to be the best person that I can is supported by the systems that I've created, right? So that there's a system of success set up to follow. And for me, that's, maybe shows more about my personality type, but maybe that exact method isn't for everybody. But people can look forward to me putting something like that out on the website at some point as like a PDF download that I was going to offer to people as they visit.
Yeah, it's helpful. I mean, definitely to have a system of your own. And I don't think there's any two systems that are identical. Even the great teachings of one Walter Russell or Krishnamurti, whoever it is that inspires you, you're always going to have your own take on somebody else's teachings. And again, that's as it should be, because the inspiration that we can all share with one another, that's the big thing that we take away from really good teachings and things like that. And one saying in particular I like is, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, not for the purpose of worshiping those giants, but learning to become giants ourselves. And so, the world doesn't need more acolytes or apparatchiks. It needs critical thinkers, people who have developed the ability to discern, between truth and falsehood, as well as to, take and accommodate what works for you, which is only ever going to be your own system, ultimately, and we can take parts of other things and make it part of our own system, but at the end of the day, it will be only your system that you use. So whatever parts work, I say, put it together and try it out. If it doesn't work, take that part out, put something else, teaching in its place. But ultimately, the system that you're looking for is one only you can develop, ultimately, at the end of the day. And it's what works for you, and what can turn your volume knob from 1 up to 10 when needed, your creative volume knob, if you will. So the more we learn to apply ourselves to any given situation, 100% of ourselves to it, the more output we're going to be able to achieve with that. So
Yeah, I think if you're like in vocation and it's very clear what you're doing, I don't think you need such a structure. I've seen some really successful people that he explained to me the way that I do it is I wake up and I do what I need to do. And I'm like, like I said, I'm a little bit more like, well, it's got to be outlined with a list and a reminder, and this is
yep.
some of the most successful people I've seen work and people that inspire me don't have everything in a calendar. Maybe at one point they used it, but they found eventually, look, I just wake up and I do my passion. I take on the things that are the highest priority. And yeah, but it's something I'll test out. As you said, one system isn't for everybody, and we're not lacking widgets necessarily. That's not necessarily the issue, is it? But as people, check out my work, I'd like to have something to give back besides just the content, something more tangible. Now, speaking of turning up volume knobs, you mentioned cranking it up to 11 or 10, maybe you said.
Mm-hmm.
You've also criticized people trying to raise their vibration and turn that needle up. What's
Yeah.
the misunderstanding there, and what do you propose instead?
Yeah, that's very interesting because it was one particular passage in the home study course by Walter and Leo, and um, the sentence read, "There are absolutely no vibrations to the spirit whatsoever," and they were speaking about the Creator and our spirit as well. Our very own spirit has no vibration. It's not divided. It's not. That's why we can't sense spirit. We can't sense the spirit in somebody. We can see it animated through the body, but we can't actually sense the spirit. So that one sentence I contemplated for months and months alone, just going over it for hours daily almost. And it was basically what led to a divorce between me and this new age movement, higher dimensions, things of this nature, which I thoroughly debunked in my Dispelling Dimensional Madness. But in Knowing the Creator, episode 2, I debunked the raising your vibrations notion. And so we cannot be afraid to call out these new age fallacies because they're limitations to our understanding. And it also is at odds with the Kabbalion that says God is an extremely high vibration. Of course, the Kabbalion was written by the three Masons or three initiates, they call themselves. So it's borrowed Hermetic principles, but again, there's an inversion in that, saying God is an extremely high vibration, when clearly it's not. Otherwise, we'd be able to sense God, like we could plutonium or uranium emanations, which give off the heat in those elements. So if God was vibrational, we'd have discovered it somewhere vibrating. But that's just it. The obvious to me was that, of course, Russell's right. There are no vibrations to the spirit whatsoever. And that, again, there's the demarcation line in these teachings that is very clear that the senses cannot know anything. And so how does materialist science put its entire foundation on the senses alone? We can't sense love, but everybody uses the word. So what is it really? If we can't weigh it, we can't quantify it, measure it, we can't tell what color it is, is it even real? But yet we use the word. The same for beauty. We can see beauty. We can experience beauty, but we can't really, say it exists because it's not something that is perceived with the senses. It's something that is perceived with the mind. And certain things are only perceivable with the mind, which bypasses the senses altogether. In other words, some things can only be known. And unfortunately, in the day of materialism, which is, I'm thankful to say, coming to an end, although it's a slow one. Many people are awakened to these new ideas. There are things we can know that are not sensible. They can't be sensed, but we can absolutely know them. And, that's a part of human intuition that we're only beginning to discover. And the teachings of a Walter and Leo Russell, for instance, in this particular area, are so extremely helpful to consider and to contemplate this new possibility, what it means to actually know. And I will also use the metaphor of there's no knowledge in a library, which I can talk more about if you want.
Yeah, go right ahead. I mean, we'll touch on that. The scientific materialist worldview, just to touch on what you said, is bankrupt from the get because they're presupposing things that are immaterial in their own process. So it's not just a physical process. You can't see logic somewhere, which science uses as part of its scientifical process is logic. And this isn't something we can pin down and identify with our senses. This is something that's coming from mind, and so even their own presuppositions of trying to identify as only hardcore materialist is basically like doomed from the get. They've already presupposed things that defeat their own argument in that way.
Very astute observation. Yeah, the logicity itself and reason are things that the mind does, not the senses. So what are those things that they say have no existence, yet that is the core and foundational tenets of their entire philosophy of physicalism? So yeah, that's very astute. To explain the no knowledge in a library, there's books in a library. The books have paragraphs, they have pages, paragraphs, sentences, words, and the words are made of letters. All of these are symbols. Any more than you could go into a Japanese library and just read and understand what it is you're reading, which most of us can't unless you speak Japanese, Tyler, or your listeners, one of them happens to. They might be able to grok some understanding out of what it is they're reading, but basically it's the same. Even in English, if you take what you're reading, what you're absorbing through your senses, through your eyesight, or if you're blind through the braille, what you're absorbing, there's no knowledge in these letters, in these symbols. But when your mind decodes the meaning of these symbols in the way that they are placed, in the cadence that they are placed in, that's when it takes on its meaning. And what you're actually doing when you read a book is you're recollecting the thoughts of the author as he thought them or she thought them. And that is what is happening in your mind, not in your senses. And so the knowledge is actually in the mind itself. And the words and the symbols and the paragraphs and the pages are what wake up that memory of this knowledge, or that knowledge that's yet to be experienced, you could say. And so when you really understand something, when you stand under it, or you understand it, whichever term you want to use, basically you're getting to the bottom.
That's a beautiful, beautiful metaphor for describing such an issue where someone would say, oh, that's total horseshit. I don't know what you're saying. It's words on the book and I'm reading them. And so, again, coming at it from this completely different worldview. I was going to say a little bit different. No, it's completely different worldview of what we're taught and the way that we perceive things. And I've had conversations with these kind of people, and they'll pull out the quantum card every time, right? The slit experiments, shooting photons. I've tried to understand how we're shooting photons or where they got this gun that can do this, but it usually will end up in a quantum argument of some kind, and it's like we just don't understand is kind of the end result of those kinds of conversations. So having a good metaphor like that, or math, numbers aren't existing in nature, right? There's not the number 2 in nature. But does the number 2 exist? I mean, in physical nature, right? In the physical world. The concept of it does, right? That we can see two buildings, but that doesn't equate to the number two existing in the physical world where we can look at it and we just have models of what it might mean, but these concepts don't exist in the physical world.
Right. We have to recollect them in the mind, right? I mean, that's exactly right what you're saying. And there's no letter A in existence until man physically wrote it, so we can point to the letter A or point to the number two, but it's more of a concept and always will be a concept. Again, concepts are mental constructs. So Walter said, all knowledge exists and it can be ours for the asking. And that God is the omniscient one, the all knowing, you could say. And so, all knowing in itself, anything we wish to know, if we ask God for that, and that's why they were so adamant about forming a moment to moment relationship with the Creator, was so that you could bring out new knowledge from the stillness within yourself. And the more that you are able to commune with the Creator, the more you will be able to uh, get new knowledge, to absorb new concepts, to have new thoughts, new thinkings, new ideas, and all that can serve to uplift your fellow man. Those who take their fellow man down are generally the hedonists of the world. They live merely to satisfy their senses, to glorify their senses, and so the bloodlust, the killings, the human trafficking, the satanic rituals, the blood and semen and all this stuff that's associated with the Abramovics of the world and the Epsteins and whatever else. All of these things are, basically inversions of spirit, which is, again, it's an inside out sort of view. And the more materialistic you are, the more stuff sticks to you. Okay. The more your senses become dominantly important versus the spirit, which gets pushed into the back seat and just rides along quietly for 80 years or whatever it is. So the powers that never were is what I like to call them. They just assumed control, and then everybody believed that they actually had power. Their power is sort of like coal, oil, nuclear. That's power to them, to control electricity. Whereas to the illuminate, to the mystic, power is the use of the God as mind. The use of God as mind in themselves is the real power. And that power doesn't vibrate. It's not divided. And so this again correlates with the Jungian wholeness principle perspective. There's others out there who have, talked about this. And it's a very one-to-one relationship. You don't require a priest. You don't need a guru. You don't have to go to church. You certainly don't have to go through any man or woman to get, the benefits of a moment-to-moment relationship with the Creator. You have to talk to God through yourself and with yourself. That's who you're communicating to, is the self of all selves. But it seems silly at first, but it really is, it's at the core of this tradition, of the mystical tradition, is to utilize the arts in such a way that you can express your uniqueness, your authentic self, be original and be inspiring. And that really is, what my moniker is authentic, inspiring, and original. And that's really, for me, it just describes living a life knowingly working with God. And those three things for me are just stuff that comes right out of that experience, so, and it's been what I've tried to do is just really inspire my fellow man, because the more inspired you are and the more inspiration you can give to others through doing what truly inspires you. See, it's sort of a multiplication principle thing. It multiplies You give out your light and others multiply their own because they're within the vicinity, they're within the sound of your voice, or they're inspired by some creation you make, and suddenly they want to do more inspiring things. And so it's sort of, as Thomas Jefferson said, we must ignite the brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. Well, there's more than just freedom. That is a brush fire. Inspiration is perhaps the greatest of all brush fires.
Yeah, I've got a book in my queue right now written by about Thomas Jefferson's style of education for our kids. We just signed them up for a course where they'll be taking on the model of Thomas Jefferson education, and where the kids sort of help each other learn, and they group off in age groups, but then also commingle, and the older kids learn the leadership. And so, yeah. So with the I think people are the powers that never should have been. Right? People are giving away their power to them. Essentially, they're not necessarily all powerful in that way. It's like people are giving their power away to them. And maybe that's going to answer this next question a little bit, is like, why is Russell's work, or Tesla, or people like yourself even, why is that work so suppressed or seemingly not existent in the mainstream, with Russell science completely being missed as far as anything I ever understood before coming across yourself? And so why do you think that, I agree. I think people are giving their power away, but at the same time, like, why is this work so suppressed?
That's very easy to answer that, because they wouldn't be needed anymore. They're out of a job. So if every man and woman and child knew that God dwelled within them, what would happen to the churches? What would happen to the fifth dimension groups? Where would this all go? Where would it all end up? Self-reliability, the ability to communicate directly to God without a middleman would be the end of a lot of this, especially the priesthood. The priesthood is probably, and that's why when Russell released the Universal One, the Pope basically threatened to issue a decree against the man if he reprinted that book. Basically, the feeling amongst the Catholic Church was, how dare you introduce new doctrine without our permission? Because this doctrine, the science of a two-way motion universe, and just a very short 5 years later is when they came out with their one-way heat, death, dying universe of a Big Bang through their Jesuit priest, Monsignor Georges Lemaitre. Just 5 short years, they effectively countered this two-way motion idea, which was introduced into the minds of 700 prominent scientists and 300 universities in those 1,000 copies that went out in 1927 of the Universal One. So they had to more or less bury this notion of a two-way universe. And basically all it was, if all bodies are self-similar, and the universe must be as above, so below, as within, so without. This is a Hermetic principle, but it's a principle of nature nonetheless. Everything inhales in nature. Trees, planets, suns, moons, humans, insects. But yet the model of the universe has no inhalation. It's just one big exhalation that started in a cataclysm and ends in one. So it's my thinking that the priesthood, in order to protect itself from this idea that was catching on in the early 30s, decided to release a one-way theory that was in direct opposition to Russell's two-way motion universe. And eventually his two-way idea was buried, unfortunately, because it could have completely changed the face of science. But it's so interesting to me that this theory of his, this concept, I would say, not a theory, but a concept, because you can actually conceive of it because it happens in bodies everywhere. The inhalation process, the uphill flow of electricity, not just the running down, dying half of the wave of creation, which is the death half. Um, that would have helped shore up the Catholic Church, because had they adopted Russell's science and said, look, this man has put the creator back into creation, but they decided to go with the creator-less version of a scientific cosmology, which is very interesting to me. You know, why did the largest priesthood, who claims that their own vicar, you know, their own pope is the vicar of Christ, the stand-in for Jesus until he returns, why would they not go with a creator-centric science and instead opt for one that puts their own God, consigns their own God to a cosmic death sentence? It's very interesting. But they also named the largest telescope in the world Lucifer. So, you know, again, the priesthood would have been out of business, and that's the short end of that answer. But.
Yeah. So, with the concept of new knowledge coming from illumination, like you were alluding to in the beginning, and this history of some of the greatest achievements coming from someone going through a cosmic illumination or having cosmic consciousness. With that, what sort of scientific paradigms or modern beliefs do you think are just like completely outdated, that we have, like you're explaining, this new information essentially that challenges the old paradigm, but yet it seems like we're happy to keep the old paradigm in place, that we're not looking to change anything anytime soon as far as, you know, what we're going to be teaching the masses in the public indoctrination system. What are some of the obvious things through your studies that you think should just be completely done away with?
Well, I'd do away with higher dimensions almost immediately. Raising your vibrations, a lot of this new age drivel garbage. um, you know, Dispelling Dimensional Madness was a documentary I had wanted to make for a good decade, and I finally put my foot down and got to it. Got another one I'm actually decided to delay because I've got just mass amount of things happening.
Great
currently.
work on that, by the way. I really like the Dispelling Dimensional Madness.
Yeah, thank you. It's a couple hundred hours of intense research went into to do the final things but I'd taken a full 10 years of just, you know, consideration around the whole, you know, to formulate my own thoughts into how I would, you know, present my argument. But the research was just, again, something massive, but I've got one on the queue currently, and it's going to be probably delayed by another year or so, I'd say, possibly more, maybe less, but, and that's called Free Will and Evil. So again, in science, there's another, as your question alludes to, what would I get, you know, just remove from this explanation of, you know, or cosmology, or what would I remove that is fraud, or, you know, and this whole idea that we don't have free will, that we live in a deterministic universe, you know, is another one that is, as you said earlier about certain scientific assumptions, when it comes to logic, for instance, you know, you can't really say, here's logic, and hold it in your hand or weigh it or measure it. You know, it's a concept. So it's something that can only be known with the mind, like the word love. It's just, you can't measure it or weigh it. But all scientists use the word when they leave for work in the morning. Bye, honey, I love you. See you later. Or the kids, I love you, kids. So yeah, this idea that you don't have free will and that we live in a computer simulation, which is big in the new age as well. You know, the Ikes and others like to use that to explain, you know, that we live in this computer simulation. But it's funny because until computers were invented, the idea never existed outside of mystical circles, which said this is a simulation of mind, a simulation of matter, but that it's all really mind at the end of the day. But that simulation versus a computer simulation were really two different things. So again, the differentiation and demarcation line between computer simulation and simulation of matter, which is the effect of the cause of mind, are two completely different ideas. Similar in one regard, that what you think you see is real isn't, but dissimilar in so many other ways. So I would say too, I would bring back the the feeling okay to use the term God, if you would like, because it's really not anybody's business what you think that term means. And I don't like people who say you can't use a word. I'll use it on purpose just because somebody tells me you shouldn't use that word. Well, God, 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 God. I'll use it anytime I want, you know. It's my free will, right? So again, there's, the free will and evil. The evil idea, and I'll just say I would do away with that too, that so many people believe evil is a force of all its own, that it's existent outside of man. Yet in my search for evil, and I did search, I went to find the devil once, and God showed up instead. I'll just leave that there because it's quite a long story. But the only evil, and this is where I agree with 100% with a Russell perspective, is that evil, sin, and shame are created by man himself, and he's solely responsible for it. And that's a hard one for a lot of people to swallow because they don't want the responsibility of thinking that they, in some way, shape, or form created situations that were unpleasant. But I mean, and in some cases, it's just too much responsibility for a lot of people to bear. So it's easier to blame something external for evil in this world, but show me anything in nature, and a volcano, don't bring up the volcano example. That's not evil. That's just a difference in pressure potentials that are leveling themselves out, or a rock face falling into the ocean, earthquake. These are just, these things aren't evil. And that's one of the materialists' arguments, is that there's this thing called natural evil, which are like earthquakes and, or a bus goes off a cliff, but nobody wants to talk about the fact that the day before it was in the shop and the guy didn't fix the steering wheel correctly. And so 30 kids died in a ravine, but that just proves there's evil. So I would do away with the concept of evil and start putting it squarely on the shoulders of man where it belongs, because there's plenty of evil in men, and I've seen it. I used to be that out of balance that I was able to create those kinds of things, so I know firsthand that, in other words, most of my own, when I shop, I like to say it's a hard thing to take responsibility for shooting yourself in your own foot. But again, a lot of people like to blame things outside of themselves for the reasons this or that happened. So to me, just some of the things I'd say on that list are, what I mentioned there.
You've described the fulcrum as that center point where God is within, and then also these inner demons that you've battled, or that other people are battling. Like, what do you think some of the stronger inner demons are, and what are some of the techniques that you use to access that still point within? I know, like we said, techniques are going to be different for everybody, but if you don't mind sharing, like, some form of tangible process that we can use to access that fulcrum.
Well, first you have to acknowledge it. I mean, if you don't acknowledge it, how can you possibly access it? So I would acknowledge it, access, express, and above all, learn to hold it, because it's part of you. That is your animating spirit. The spirit animates the body. It is that which animates. And the demons are usually on the body side. And by demons, I mean more of the archetypal, emotional, the rage, the anger, hurt, let down, um, the feeling of not being loved. These things are deep rooted, but they're more or less things that occur more in the body, the somatic side of it. And really, until you get your mind right and you set these repeating patterns free, you void their repetition by your awareness of them. This is what man calls demons, these things that repeat, that constantly bring continual pain. When you become aware of it, that is the only point at which you can then stop its repetition. So it stops having an effect on you. Now you can be aware of one of these things and choose not to, and that can either bring you further pain or a further chance to learn. But one way or another, once you become aware of it, it's kind of hard to hide it. And again, it's really up to the human being that has to face these things in themselves as to what their choice, to whether to either deal or not deal with it. But at least I would say the best thing you can do is become aware of those patterns in you. And there's been many patterns in me that I had to become aware of over time and learn to uh, put them down, lay them down, or just not have them repeat any further. And it's different for everybody because we all have these unique things, problems, and we have to figure out ways that are best for us to deal with them. But again, I just like to come at it from the psychological angle. That thing that repeats, that is painful, the reason it repeats is because it's trying to get your attention. It's wanting to come to the surface. It's wanting to be noticed so that you can deal with it. And when you become aware of that pattern, that's the point at which you can void its repetition. So,
What would you think the consequences will be of us ignoring doing that work, ignoring what I would phrase it as like nature and its law or natural law? I know that can be differently interpreted, but what are the consequences of us ignoring voices like Walter Russell, like yourself, like those that are putting forward this universal law or like a natural law governance over our behavior and morality? What is the consequences of us ignoring these laws?
yeah, the detrimental effects will just continue, more or less. And until you become aware, you know, I would say learn to listen to your conscience because, as was said in the cartoon with Jiminy Cricket, always let your conscience be your guide. I come back to this in every interview, but it's something I think a lot of people can relate to. And how many people listen to their conscience anymore these days? And that would be what any great illuminate would tell you. Listen to your conscience. It's the still small voice of God whispering, whispering all the time, whispering to you. And yet nobody listens. And so these detrimental patterns, these detrimental effects of not listening or having a relationship, a real-time relationship with God will be the continuance of basically unbalance, which it can also be called sin or evil. If I was to define evil with a more upgraded definition, I would just say it's unbalance. And if you need an example, look at any of these psychopaths in elite positions and ask yourself, do the things they do cause unbalances in the world? And it's absolutely yes, 100%. Now, if they were doing things that were creating balanced effects, we wouldn't call them evil. So by the very definition of being unbalanced, that is what evil truly is. And we're all capable of it, or sin, missing the mark, if you will, which from the Scottish meaning. But you really have to go and sin no more. You have to devote yourself to being as balanced of a human being as you can possibly be. It's simply do that which in your still small voice, when you dialogue with the creator within and you ask God or your still small voice, if I do this thing, will the result be balance? And it won't lie. It'll tell you, yes, it will balance, or no, it won't. And again, it's developing that relationship, that moment to moment relationship, literally with your own conscience, which is the voice, the still small voice that is always whispering. It's a gift to develop it. I mean, it is, as Walter said, the greatest gift that man has, and yet he throws it away. So don't throw your conscience away. Keep it and learn to listen to it. That'd be my advice.
What's the most important thing that you would like people to come away from this conversation with, or the most important thing you think people have forgotten on their journey?
Well, learn to listen again to the still small voice within and develop a dialogue with the creator moment to moment, because you can use this all through your life, the rest of your life. You'll have it. It's the greatest tool in your toolbox, if you will. And it doesn't require, again, going through a middleman. You don't have to pay money to access it. It's free. And it's the most powerful gift that could ever lie before us. And how few actually ever use it. It baffles me. But, just one of the consequences of being human. We often buy into those who say, the atheists who believe there is no God. That's a belief too. But, and then there's those and they just happen to coincide mostly with scientism, so, but the mystical view, the classical mystic, is that, as Evelyn Underhill would say, mysticism is the art of union with reality. And so don't lose that mystical side to life, because you could be losing the very best part of yourself, and it is somewhat mystical to say, I'm going to speak with God about this. I mean, how many people actually say that when you ask them a question? Hey, do you want to go in on a venture with me for a business? Let me talk to God first. I'll get back to you. You'd be looked at like you have three heads or something. But so there perhaps may come a time in the course of humanity where we're not shy about having the relationship with the creator, which I and my Father are one. To the degree you can say that and it rings with absolute truth is to the degree you can wield a very powerful existence, because you're working in tandem with the creator versus just praying to some deadbeat God that owes back human support and is off gallivanting around in some quadrant of the universe somewhere, and we're all waiting for him to come back one day to judge the whole planet. That's not a concept I can get into. And I tried, but it's so foreign now when I think of it. How did I ever believe that? And so when I began to work knowingly with God, the synchronicities increased, and that was my gauge. The more synchronicities, the closer I am to understanding and truly living a divine life with a divine purpose.
Beautifully said, Matt. Tell me and us about your creative project, The Order of the One. And this is a new project for you, right?
It is I'd say about a year in the making. It's been painstaking to get it going. It is a musical project with a guitar player friend of mine from North Carolina, Robert Caines. And the two of us are ever searching for a drummer to complete the trio. So if you've any drummer friends out there or listeners play drums, visit mattpresti.com and click on the "Are you a drummer looking for a musical opportunity" link, which is just a little ways down on the page. But So it's a progressive rock project, hard rock, prog metal, possible. Uh, Lots of songs are in the making right now, and we just released our second single called Black Swan, and it's got some. It's a project that we more or less we tuned to 432 because we want to use the sacred solfeggio frequency, and um, Order of the One basically means order of the creator, you could say. Music from the fulcrum of our existence, and it's sort of captures elements of Rush, and my guitar player is very influenced by Dream Theater, so some of our writing will eventually, you know, be nods to different bands that we grew up on, but it's more or less just a good feeling to be able to write music that inspires you and touches your heart and soul, and without any worry about what people think about it. I mean, I know we won't attract, we're not writing it for the world, we're writing it for ourselves. And we believe that the side effect of doing things that way will be wealth and a good following is what we're hoping for and to eventually play out. So, but yeah, orderoftheone.com, you can find everything about the band there, and support us, buy one of the songs and or both, and keep following us because we're going to be releasing more stuff down the road.
Yeah, and you've got a ton of creative work that you've put out, the music that you've worked on, and including this new project. It's great stuff. And I'll have to get some tips from you on creating a nice studio. Speaking of man caves, we're going to be setting up a 14 by 40 unit on the property that'll be our gym jam room. My son, he wants to play the drums, and
Awesome.
he's already got some stuff that he can practice with, but not a full set. So we need to create a space for that. And in the end, you know, selfishly, it may be somewhat of the man cave, like you talked about. We're also going to have our gym in there, so on property, as in preparation for the next pandemic, you know, whatever may be coming our way. We're going to be here on the property with a lot of the stuff that we need to be able to keep creating, keep staying in shape. And so in this episode, the intro is something that he created. It'll be the first premiere of his little 15-second clip for my podcast that I asked him to make. So he'll catch some inspiration from your words there and what you said and the things that you're working on. Hopefully, I'm also training him to edit, so he's going to come in and help me post-produce. But yeah, so the when people hear the intro on this one, it's different than the one I normally use, and that's coming from Vinny. So I want to attribute him to doing that.
How old is he? You don't mind me asking.
He's 14.
All right. That's about the year I started getting into keyboards. So stay with it. Vinny, if you can hear this, keep going. And, you know, just the more you practice, the better you're going to get. So that's the real secret, is not just hold the thought of being a great drummer, but woodshed, brother. Woodshed, 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 which is practice, practice, practice. And in 7 years, you're going to be a top-notch drummer, guaranteed.
That's good advice for anyone doing a creative process. What other thoughts would you like to leave us with, or anything else that you'd like to leave here before we wrap up?
Yeah, for your listeners, if they're interested in supporting the University of Science and Philosophy, Walter and Leo Russell, the official website is philosophy.org, and you can enter this coupon code until the end of August. It's Veritas20. Veritas20, all capital letters, Veritas20. And just click on the store at philosophy.org and you'll get 20% off all books and booklets until August 31st. So that helps support the university and helps preserve the legacy of Walter Russell and Leo Russell for future generations and posterity. So really appreciate anybody that does that. And it's better than the books you'll get off of Amazon, which are a lot of cheap copies that are printed in India and don't really help the foundation. So again, anybody out there interested in this, just check out philosophy.org. And for all things Matt Presti, you can visit mattpresti.com. And then my band project is orderoftheone.com.
I'll definitely put those links in the show notes, and really appreciate you for joining me, Matt, taking the time. And it was a beautiful episode. I think people are really going to appreciate the information here. And I would advise people to continue checking out more of Matt's work on his Rumble page. He also has a YouTube where he links to the full length stuff on Rumble. Good method to not get messed with and keep your stuff up there, but still have the outlet on the old, YouTube. But yeah, Rumble is where you'll find a lot more of the full feature stuff, and I'll put those links in the show notes as well.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that's the main tech podcast, the Exploration of Consciousness. And then I've got the Tech Talk, which is more the fireside chat. So maybe you might join me on Tech Talk at some point, talk about, your work and whatnot. And I'll be checking out more of your work as well. I'm glad to always discover podcasters that, are into it, for reasons that are, as you shared. So yeah, looking forward to that. And thanks for the invitation, Tyler. It's really great to join you today.
Thank you, Matt. All right, take care.
Merkabra.